Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Shrink Think, which is the YouTube channel for the Association for NPD and Psychopathy Survivor Treatment, Research, and Education. I am Sandra Brown, president of the association, and I'm joined today by our co-host, Chelli Pumphrey. Hey, Chelli.
Hello, Sandra, and hello, everybody. Glad to be back. I am on the board with Sandra, and I'm a licensed professional counselor specializing in working with survivors of pathological love relationships and trauma. And we are here today to continue. This is part 2 of an exploration that we've been doing into the super trait of agreeableness. And just a little refresher for those of you that have been following, one of the big things that we teach is about the impact of personality traits on survivors and their vulnerability to narcissists, sociopaths, psychopaths. What I think this is one of my favorite things to talk about, because there's so much misinformation out there about how people become involved in these relationships. And often, the culprit is this codependency idea, which on some level, sometimes that can look true, but if you don't get down to the root of what really causes it, you're not going to fix it and therefore prevent this in the future or adequately heal. So we are talking about agreeableness. We have agreeableness and conscientiousness, which are two of the super traits that Sandra and Purdue University had discovered when they were doing research on survivors. And last time we worked on, we're looking through the different facets of this agreeable trait. And last time we focused on trust and straightforwardness and how that plays into these relationships. And today we're going to move on down the line here of these different facets. So Sandra, I think the next thing that we wanted to focus on was the giving nature of agreeableness.
Yeah. Do you have that on a PowerPoint slide you can pop up here?
Let me share this. Let me get this all ready here.
So while you're getting that ready, just sort of as a reminder, we started this, as Chelli said, in the last video, and we covered the facets of trust and straightforwardness. And as a reminder, facets make up the whole overarching trait. And this trait is the trait of agreeableness. A lot of people look at the facet list and think it's like a checklist that, oh, yes, this applies to me. No, this doesn't. That these are all parts that make up agreeableness. And so these are the trait of agreeableness is a beautiful, wonderful trait. All the facets that we're going to be going over, you will see and think, what the heck is wrong with this? And there's nothing wrong with this. I mean, that was, I think, the issue that Purdue said in the study, which is there is nothing, these are beautiful traits. The problem is that they become problematic in the hands of pathological people, which sort of proves the point that even a good thing can be used as a weapon in their hands. And so these traits make these survivors the wonderful people that they are. And these traits have helped them be successful in normal relationships, as a parent, as a friend, an employee, etc. And Purdue had said they thought that the only place that this could be problematic in having a little bit too much of this trait is exactly where we have seen it, in the hands of pathological people. So so, I want to begin with all the positives of this trait, because this really is a beautiful, beautiful trait. So we covered the issue about trust and straightforwardness. And now we're going to talk about the facet of a giving nature. And this is related to having an altruistic sort of nature, that not because of people pleasing necessarily or codependency, that hardwired in their innate, how they came into the world, personality, they are sacrificially oriented by nature. And when we see this as therapists, we automatically, try to apply this to codependency. And I think we have not had another concept or word or language for the idea of high relationship investment that isn't connected to the concept of codependency. And codependency concept is based on history, usually, whether it was their family upbringing or other trauma. But this aspect of altruism, or being sacrificially oriented naturally, can even appear in the personality without any history. And that it is not necessarily connected to what we tend to think about with codependency. And so they tend to be considerate. They are willing to compromise their interests for the sake of others. And again, when we hear that, we automatically think about codependency. And they tend to be sentimental, which sort of, I've noticed, plays into a little bit of, about the relational dynamic. When, for instance, they've had 10 Christmases and he's only been there for one, because he cuts and runs and goes and drinks or goes and sees another girlfriend. But in that sentimentality that is part of this facet is that she remembers the one Christmas that he was there. And in that sentimentality, is part of this relationship and investment in which they end up staying and investing to increase what they hope is the potential outcome. So how do you see this playing out in survivors?
Well, I just kind of piggyback on what you've said. It's so easy to see this through that traditional lens of codependency. And and I think what happens is when people, when a survivor has this trait, like, it is so hardwired, you can't heal this away. It's just, it's like when you have English as your first language and then you go and, you're hanging out in Germany and you don't know any German, and there's words in German that don't even translate into English. It's like you just can't even wrap your brain around it. And so this is what happens, for survivors. They're just innately forgiving and, putting this relationship first. Like you said, I'm going to focus on that one good thing that happened and forget these other bad things. And we can just spin around in circles if we keep looking at this through this old lens. And like you said, I think codependency has served a purpose, but it just, we have to drill down into what is underneath this and really understand what we're dealing with here. So yeah, that's kind of my thought on it.
Yeah, and as far as the treatment standpoint, it is in our Finding Competent Care study. This is part of failed treatment, is that either the therapist, focused on codependency, or the survivor was farmed out to codependency types of groups, and lots of them have spent years in codependency group. And not only is it sad because it's, a wasted amount of time, but that it never dealt with the real risk factors,
Right.
which is at the personality level. And so it also gets, I think, confusing that for some of the survivors, there is some stuff that could have overlap with codependency, and then therapists do get confused.
Mhm.
They don't get confused if they never learned about super traits, because that never pops up. They just take it at face value. They think that's all there is to that. So some of the survivors, do have the histories that are associated with codependency. And then there's a large swatch of these survivors who don't have the history, and which I think can be confusing. It was confusing for me when this first popped up, thinking, well, it looks like codependency, it smells like codependency, but there isn't the orientation, in history. So what else can it be?
Right.
And that's when we began looking at that. But that's certainly a confusing aspect for therapists, even after they learn about super traits. And we talk about this in the treatment workshop about how to differentiate between codependency and or super traits. All right, the next trait is this trait of cooperation. These people by nature are prone to assisting rather than attacking. They are motivated by social harmony. They are reciprocal in relationships. They are helpful, value getting along with others. They tend to avoid conflict and not out of low self-esteem. A lot of our clients are doctors. I have one that worked at the White House and the legal department. These are not, avoiding conflict is not based out of low self-concept. It is just naturally innate. They're sociable people, and they are motivated by helping, sharing, donating, and volunteering. And again, this facet is one of the ones that tends to get misread as codependency. And when I think about this facet with cooperation, being motivated by social harmony and values, getting along with others, and motivated by helping, sharing, donating, volunteering, it is no wonder that many of these survivors end up in careers that match their personality. So many of them are in the helping profession. They're therapists, nurses, teachers, clergy, doctors, those types of careers that mesh perfectly with their personality. That of course that would be a natural extension of who they are. So what do you see with this?
Well, again, I agree with everything you're saying. And what happens is when we look at survivors with this, especially with this cooperation facet, it's like their behaviors become pathologized. And that's the problem. If we just look at, oh, you are, you're a a doctor going out and trying to help others heal, or you're a therapist, or, you know, those things just in and of itself, people would value that and see that it's doing good in the world. But then when you look at a survivor with those behaviors, but they're applied to the relationship through this lens of codependency or kind of this old way of thinking, we see it as pathological. And this, and of course, this is more in the treatment workshop, but I'll just highlight where this goes, is that when you pathologize it and you're then trying to heal it as if there's something wrong with it, again, you're not going to make a lot of progress. And we're looking at trauma types of things that might make somebody codependent with, that traditional codependent behavior. We can work on trauma, we can promote healing, but when we're looking at this, if we're just looking at cooperation or just the agreeableness super trait, we're looking at managing, we're looking at awareness, we're looking at setting boundaries. And so that's just, I kind of want to put out that higher level thought of like, why is this important to know? It's good to remember that that's how, you have to differentiate things, or why you need to differentiate these things, so you're heading in the right direction.
Right. And maybe if we have time at the end, we'll talk a little bit about that issue about differentiation, because what you're going to do therapeutically for codependency is very different than when you need to work at the personality level.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. The next one is humbleness. They are very modest in her portrayal of herself. They tend to be gentle, maybe not by the time we see them, and they don't feel gentle anymore after a pathological relationship, and they have all that hyperarousal and agitation of trauma. But prior, gentle, well-tempered, warm, approachable, likable. I think some of this is also what we can see in targeting, because they are well-tempered, warm, approachable, and likable. Pathological partners sort of zoom in on that. And this sort of reminds me that, like I said, by the time we get them, they would never describe themselves as that in core personality traits, because they've been so impacted, that they're so traumatized and been irritable and aggressive,
Right.
that they don't, depending on how long they've been in the relationship, they can't remember what they were like all the way back there. But we, clinically need to understand what's underneath this layer of trauma as a core personality, because all of these facets are assets in treatment. Even when the survivor, can't see herself as being well-tempered or approachable, that those things, the surface manifestation of trauma, covers up that. And I think it's also an important factor, and we talk about this in the treatment workshop, that it's why it's important in a population that has over 60% of these survivors have this trait elevation of agreeableness, that we are using the 5-factor model in the intake package to measure and see if we are dealing with this type of personality, because then we'll know what's underneath at the core level of personality, before the trauma got slathered on there, that we're actually really able to work with as an asset. What do you think about that trait of humbleness?
Yeah, I think it's important for survivors to recognize this in themselves, especially prior to the relationship. And I agree, this is one of the most common things I see is somebody coming in with, the effects of the trauma, and they are very hypo-aroused, and they're often questioning, their role in it. Or was I the narcissist? So am I the abuser? Because look at how aggressive I got. And they have lost touch with this part of them. And so I think it's really crucial to help them kind of circle back in history and look at how they were before, during, and after the relationship, to identify and to help them just map out that this is what trauma does to you.
Right.
The gaslighting aspect as well, I think, they experience a lot of, these moments where the abuser is telling them, look, you're the crazy one, look at how you're abusing me, I'm the victim. And it just adds to this disconnect from this facet of agreeableness that at the core of it, that is not who they are. That is just a reaction to the abuse that they're living with.
Right. Our next facet is empathy, which means they are tender-minded, kind, generous, compassionate, a natural peacemaker, not necessarily from history, but from personality proclivity, and forgiving. And so this is the facet that's plastered all over the internet by bloggers and paraprofessionals who act as if this one facet is all there is problematically in regards to a survivor. You read about empaths and narcissists. This is one facet of all these facets in agreeableness and all the facets in conscientiousness that can play havoc when a survivor doesn't understand their personality and doesn't know how to do what we call chaperoning, which is sort of being, and once they understand personality as a driving force, being able to sort of be an observing witness and learning how to regulate some of the natural personality traits that led to and were targeted by in pathological relationships. It is not merely empathy. This is one small part. And bloggers take one thing they think they understand and hyper-inflated, and then survivors wrongly think this is the only thing they have to, really be concerned about. And I think along with the facet of cooperation, that empathy is another area where therapists automatically see hyper-empathy and read it as codependency. What do you think?
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think it is one of those generic, broad terms, kind of like codependency, that's been, it's been assigned to survivors.
Yeah.
But there is so much complexity to it. And it's not that it isn't a very important part of it, but when you only look at it just as one piece, you're missing out on so much of this.
Right. And other parts of the other facets that need as much guarding as your hyper empathy would need. And this is such a disservice to survivors. And then I don't know how much I agree about the whole empath stuff. I occasionally being empath, not being empathic, but this whole title of empath. And I've read some of the books on it, and I keep reading it to see, its application here with super traits. But they come away again getting this one snippet, this one piece of this facet of empathy, and think that's the answer to their problem and targeting is that they're an empath. And as we can see, empathy is part of our personality, a measurable part, as a facet, but it is not the only part.
Yeah.
The next facet is the facet of loyalty. And this too, I think, gets misread as codependency. That these survivors have very high allegiance to others, a lot of faithfulness, staying in the relationship, even when the partner is not faithful to the relationship in any shape or form. And they feel very committed to their obligations. And so the difficulty of leaving has a lot to do with the other trait we're going to be talking about, conscientiousness. But there's also this overlay here, you know, from the trait of agreeableness with this issue about loyalty and this allegiance and commitment to obligation that keeps them longer in the relationship than someone who tested lower on agreeableness, who would cut and run and say, I'm done with this crap, I'm out of here, kind of thing. This is some of the staying factor, I think, with survivors in this relationship. And they're not, again, if we would look past codependency, we would be able to see in a broader sense of this issue of loyalty being true, not just in an intimate relationship or family relationship, that they've always been loyal to their employers, to their friends, that it's not just connected to early, you know, ACE events, but as a predominant personality proclivity.
Yeah, I agree. I think, again, that idea of like pathologizing this trait really does an injustice to it and doesn't see the depth of it, because, you know, you see, you know, a good way of, well, let's say a common scenario is I'll see somebody who is very independent, very strong, like just kind of showing up in the world, and she doesn't look codependent, quote unquote, like this traditional sense of the word. And yet we're pathologizing her loyalty, but seeing it as codependency, like, oh, you're so dependent on this person, why can't you just leave? And not recognizing that if you look at the rest of the world, the rest of her relationships or her, you know, career or other kinds of patterns in her life, it doesn't align with that idea. And so this is a good way to kind of hash that out, to see, you know, loyalty versus am I codependent on this person? Very different things here.
Right. Hence the whole issue about differentiation with that. And lastly, or do we have more on the next page?
That's
it. Okay, tolerance. Another facet that often gets misread as codependency, and it's connected to their ability to be tolerant of differing opinions and behaviors. And that in and of itself, in a pathological relationship, is like the fly trap that they naturally come in. And of course, the beginning parts of the relationship or all the honeymoon cycle and wearing the mask, but sooner or later the mask comes off. And yet, in their natural proclivity is this ability to tolerate radically differing opinions and behaviors and not be run off. People who have less agreeableness tend to flock to only people that think and believe like they do. And here's this very open-minded kind of person that has the capacity of differing opinions and behaviors for quite some time until reality sinks in. But this facet is also one of those that we tend to misread.
Right. And this is one of those that really plays in, especially in the beginning, in this, tolerating negative behaviors, overlooking red flags, and along the way, there is such a high capacity to tolerate negative things that many people would never tolerate.
Right. And so again, the ability to tolerate that, they tend to, or outside people tend to think of that as a dependent kind of reaction, when in fact, a lot of the differing opinions and behaviors don't even resonate to them as problematic.
Right.
For a long period of time, because they're just naturally more open to that. And so we talk all about red flags, and a lot of times survivors have a hard time at understanding why that is what we call red flag was not a red flag for them. And
Right.
we need to understand that in their personality proclivity, because giving them a red flag list and not working at understanding themselves at a personality proclivity level, it isn't going to do the job. They're going to probably never verbalize that a lot of the stuff on the red flag list doesn't make sense to them. And again, we come into the world with our personality, and we don't think a lot about our personality or how that might be problematic, or how we should be paying attention to certain features. It's like, I always give the example, I was born with brown eyes. It would be like me trying to sit around and think about having blue eyes and seeing the world through blue eyes. It's innate. We don't think about it unless maybe an extroversion and introversion, especially if someone's really shy, they do become more aware of that. Other than that, we don't sit around and think about the impact of personality on how we think, feel, relate, and behave. And as I said before, personality as a sleeper science, we're just really, maybe in the last 15 years, coming into a much better understanding and usage of personality in a holistic approach to understanding human behavior. So so a lot of these fly under the radar, and that's why this work is not about reading a book on codependency or a red flag list when they've never been wired to act, for instance, on the facet of trust, unconditional trust. They've always had blind trust. And so you're working at the personality level, which is, not an easy thing. And as we know from personality disorders, B, not a quick thing.
Right.
So I had mentioned, so those are the facets of agreeableness. I had mentioned that we should probably just talk a minute about the issue, why differentiation is important. So I'm going to let you throw some ideas out there for therapists.
Well, again, I think anybody that's worked with a survivor who is not trained in this, which is the good majority of us, has probably had the experience of spinning their wheels and seeing a survivor just struggle for, months, if not years, with cognitive dissonance or, unable to heal or move past or leave the relationship. And this is why this information is so crucial. And this is just one aspect of what, all of this is about. But, if we do not understand the personality traits of a survivor and we are spinning our wheels on trying to heal trauma that maybe, well, there's trauma from the relationship, let's be clear, but there are these survivors, a good majority of them, who did not have significant trauma prior to the relationship. And if you're trying to heal these these long-standing codependent patterns that you thought were there, you will be spinning your wheels, and this person will, maybe they'll leave, maybe they'll look like they're better, and chances are high that they're going to end up in another pathological relationship because they have not addressed or understood what got them into it in the first place.
Right. And that differentiation, is so important because we can't, treat what we don't identify. And we come in with old theory. I'm sorry, codependency in this day and age is old theory. It's time for an update. It's been 30 years. We do have, lots new understanding that therapists need to get updated. And the issue about differentiating is the difference of the path taken in treatment. And like I said, our Finding Competent Care study, which looked at failed methodologies, was this issue about treating for codependency when they aren't codependent, but the therapist didn't have another concept for high relational investment that was related to something other than that old codependency concept. And so that, the failed treatment has had a lot to do with us not differentiating. And we drive this point home ad nauseum in the treatment workshop, that if we are here to tell you from the science that 60-some% of these survivors are not going to have codependency. So for you to get clear, it is upfront before you even begin treatment is to differentiate, to use the 5-factor model. In the treatment workshop, we talk about where they should fall. If it's too far this way or too far that way, you're dealing with different things. But you can get very clear on whether or not your treatment model should be what we teach in the treatment workshop, that model for that type of survivor, or whether your traditional model would fit or would be appropriate, or whether or not you need this different treatment model. And that's based on understanding personality. And oh my gosh, I think the biggest cheerleaders have been the survivors who literally have wept and said, everyone has always said that I'm codependent. I've sat in the coded groups for years. I knew that wasn't it. That was all surface stuff, but that at the core of who I am, that's not who I was, but there was no other explanation for it. And I've asked them to write to me and tell me, what super trait and personality sciences meant to them. And they said, for the first time in decades, I see myself as those traits as being beautiful. I don't hate that about myself. I don't see myself as needing to be fixed. Do I know that those are targets by a percentage of the people that fall within pathology, yes, but they're so wonderful for the rest of my life. I have to pay attention over here. But I'm not broken.
Right.
These were targeted. And I have such a deeper appreciation for who I am than how I felt, you know, sitting in coded groups. And I think that's the beauty of this person-centered approach that I consider super traits to be, a much more holistic looking at all aspects of a person, including personality, in a much more, you know, person-centered approach, working with the survivors who need work with the personality. So, yeah. So, that's what we have covered for today. That concludes the trait of agreeableness. And in our next video, we are going to move on to the second trait with, which is the trait of conscientiousness. And we're going to break down those facets and do the same thing that we've done here. So thanks for joining us today on Shrink Think.
Thank you.